Welcome everyone to the GSMC College Football Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start in two court cases, which is not the most interesting way to start, but we are going to start with the NCAA against Tennessee and a ruling there that will impact NIL going forward through the next many years, and then we will get into the ACC and Florida State. The ACC and Florida State just had a new group join the party there in that court case, and then we'll get into the combine a little bit. We'll talk about D linemen and linebackers that I'm watching particularly closely, and then we will finish it off with another Top 10 Tuesday. We will talk about top 10 returning quarterbacks for this upcoming year. Some interesting choices in there, so leave a comment if you agree or disagree, and we can get into a fun little back and forth. But before we start, we do get tons of questions throughout the show, and I think the best way to do that, the best way for you guys to see it on the screen and for us to have a fun back and forth here, is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, streamelements.com/GSMCSportsNetwork./tip. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to see your questions on the screen. I can answer them, and we can have a fun segment here. So let's jump right in, why don't we? Because tons of stuff has happened throughout the sport over the last couple of weeks, and one of the big things that has kind of been overshadowed over the last week or so has been the NCAA's case against Tennessee. And all of this started right when Tennessee had gotten accused of NIL violations surrounding their current quarterback, Nico Iamaleava, and I think it created this interesting dynamic between the NCAA and pretty much every school in the country, because there was always going to be a moment where the NCAA went after someone and they didn't take it, I guess. They refused to just roll over and take the punishment and keep moving. So Tennessee was that person, right? They decided to say, they have no grounds to do this. This is not fair in any way. And Virginia joined them in that fight, and they got a huge win over the last weekend. They had their preliminary injunction was denied by a judge in Tennessee, I believe, that basically said that the NCAA policing NIL the way they have likely violates antitrust laws, which creates a whole can of worms that we will get into here in a second. And I think the one thing to keep in mind here is the NCAA came into NIL a little bit late, right? Because they were very, very hesitant to join the party as early as they probably should have, with a lot of people pushing for it for many, many years. They took their time and they dragged their feet for a fairly large amount of time, and then the states took over, right? We had California and Florida and Texas, and all of these different states passed their own NIL laws, and it created problems for the NCAA because then they had to play catch-up. And playing catch-up in something like this is obviously never a great idea, because as we went in, they either didn't have any guardrails around NIL, so it was the Wild West, and then when they tried to put in guardrails, they didn't have a good idea of what the guardrails should be and how they should look, so it's created problems like this. And now we're kind of back to the Wild West a little bit, since a court has ruled in favor of Tennessee, and obviously this is not the end-all be-all in this case. There is still stuff to happen in this case, and still tales to be spun here, but there's definitely a lot of momentum on Tennessee's side, and for the time being, it doesn't look like the NCAA can really enforce many of the NIL rules that they had been enforcing for the last couple of years, and that creates a whole bunch of problems in the grand scape of, first of all, the NCAA, because there have been a lot of people for a long time wondering, is the NCAA going to be around much longer? And I've been one of those people. I tend to believe this might be kind of the nail in the coffin, as it were. I think the NCAA has been toying around with, they just haven't been, the central figure that college football has needed in a very long time, to be totally honest. And I think there was always going to be a thing that, necessitated them moving on and bringing in a third part, or basically the own governing board for college football, because I think we all agree it's totally different than every other sport in NCAA sports, right? If the NCAA were to keep in charge of all of the other sports other than football, I think that's fine, because the reality is none of these sports operate the same way football is going to operate. So obviously this kind of hurts the NCAA in a lot of different ways. This could be the thing that officially, puts an end to the NCAA, at least as a governing body over college football. And overall, I think that's a good thing for college football, right? It's different than every other sport, like we just said, and it needs different governing bodies. It needs different rules. It needs different regulations. And the NCAA just wasn't learning that or getting up to speed on that as quickly as they probably should have. Now, obviously, there's tons of questions that come from this. The short-term one is, what happens in this 2025 recruiting cycle? Because things just got very free and open for these teams a little bit, because the NIL essentially doesn't have any leg to stand on when, going after teams for NIL violations. So kind of back to the Wild West, the way we didn't like it. So I wonder, first of all, what happens in the short term with this 2025 recruiting cycle? How quickly can they get new rules into place and maybe a new governing body into place? I don't know how long that would take. But also, what does NIL look like after all of this? Because I think we all agree that NIL as it is right now is not sustainable, and there's going to be a total flip at some point, whether that's, football players signing contracts with schools or conferences, becoming employees. I think all of that stuff is on the table. In fact, I think them becoming employees of the school or the conference is most likely what's going to happen, because not only does it necessitate, it helps with, if they sign contracts, there are very clear-cut rules within each conference, which I think is probably the way they're going to go, is you sign with whatever conference you're in. So if you're a Texas quarterback like Quinn Ewers, you would be employee of the SEC. And I think, first of all, that would open them up to get some revenue sharing from different media deals that they probably deserve to get revenue sharing from prior to this, but that's none of my business. I think it opens doors for so many different things throughout college football, and I think one of the big things that it helps in a lot of ways is just taking all the guesswork out of the different rules and the different injunctions that are going on. Because when this first came forward and the NCAA was coming after Tennessee for violating NIL rules, there were a lot of people that immediately assumed either they did it and they were all against Tennessee, and I think a lot of those people were people that don't love Tennessee in general, but also there were a group of people that thought the NCAA was full of it and didn't have a leg to stand on and all of this different stuff. So it's created a lot of confusion and a lot of gray area in all of these different cases that we go through, and I don't think that's good for anyone. I don't think it's helpful for the players, because they have a weird idea of what they can and what they can't do. I think it's not good for schools. I know that, because it creates the same problem essentially. And then it's not good for the NCAA or the sport in general, because us as fans have very little idea of what's going on behind closed doors. And even if we did have a good idea of what's going on behind closed doors, we don't know if that's okay or not, because we have such a loose idea of what the rules are. I think if you bring on athletes as employees of a conference, then you can have rules within that conference that are very clear-cut, whether that's a NIL salary cap, whether that's a number of, NIL deals you can give out to a certain player, or whatever that looks like. At the very least, you'll have that structure that I think a lot of people have been yearning for in college football for the last little bit. And I think one of the very, very interesting layers of this that Josh Pate had brought up on his show, I think on Sunday, he was talking about what does this mean for if these players sign contracts and they become employees and they get quote unquote a salary, whether that's collective bargaining agreements or media rights deals, wherever they get that from, right? It then creates an issue, sort of, because the reality is then they're employees and then they get taxed accordingly, right? You get taxed depending on your different tax bracket and all of those different things. But then that would open the door for different states to really move up in this world because, as we know, some states have state income tax, some don't. And that was a very interesting point that I had never really thought of in this craziness because teams like Texas and Texas A&M, no state income tax in Texas. That's got to be a huge selling point. I believe in Florida they don't have any state income tax. So there are teams that are going to possibly benefit from this just because of where they land on a map, which is a wild thing to think about, and might, push even more states to go in that direction because, as we know, football programs and college football in general is a huge revenue builder for not only, the university and the conference, but the state overall. I mean, Georgia football and all of that brings in a ton of money for the state of Georgia in general. So there is that layer of this that I think a lot of people might not be thinking about, but absolutely will be factored in when recruiting a kid because if you can go into their living room and say, we'll pay you the same money on paper that you would be making at Ohio State or at Colorado or wherever, but the state's not going to take X amount out of your paycheck, those kids would be very much inclined to go to that school because more money helps everyone, right? I mean, all these kids, there are tons of people worrying that all these kids are thinking about is money. Well, if that's the case, then these schools are going to win out tons and really monopolize the recruiting game. So it'll be very interesting to see how all of that develops, how maybe the new governing body puts that in check. And another thing that Josh Pate brought up that I think is important to keep in mind when thinking about all of the problems in college football, whether it's playoff expansion or conference realignment or NIL or the transfer portal, all this different stuff that is going on around the sport. It's a great thing that Tennessee did this, right? Because all of this needs to fall apart before it can be put back together. There was no reality where college football was going to come out of this with a very smooth transition into this beautiful, perfectly run land that we're all hoping they find themselves in. But all of this had to fall apart. The NCAA had to essentially lose a lot of their power over the college football world. Someone needed to challenge them for that to happen. Tennessee was the one to do that. So I think it helps a ton with the new era of college football because there's so much question about not only what does the new era look like, but who's in charge of the new era, right? At the very least, now they're pushed towards making those, creating answers for those questions, right? They officially have a pushing force against them that makes them have to create answers for all of this. They have to create a new governing body for college football. They have to create rules around NIL or all of this stuff that I just talked about, all of the different, pitfalls with state income tax and recruiting and all of these different things that could happen in the short term and the long term for NIL will start to happen. So obviously there is tons of unanswered questions here. There's tons of questions about what the future of college football looks like. But at the end of the day, I tend to think it's a good thing that this happened. I think it's a good thing that at some point someone sort of stood up to the NCAA, created this earnest on not only are the rules that they're putting into place not enforceable by law in a lot of ways, but also these people just aren't the correct people to be running the sport anymore. And that's just kind of the way it is, and it had to come to an inflection point, and I think this might be it. I think this might be the moment that everyone looks at and reminds themselves that the NCAA just isn't quite fit anymore to keep up with the world of college football, and that's okay. We just need to answer a lot of the questions that are currently unanswered. But still tons to happen on that front, still tons of questions to be answered in terms of the NIL and this fight in particular, because while this is a huge win for Tennessee, doesn't not the end all be all, right? So still ton to figure out there, ton to answer, but at least we're starting to go towards the track of answering those questions. So, but we're going to take a short break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the ACC and ESPN teaming up against Florida State, which is a very interesting development in that case. But we're going to take a short break, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits some loose shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the craziness going on around NIL and the NCAA against Tennessee, because that is a huge talking point in college football right now. And now we'll get into another court case. The ACC has been going at it with Florida State for quite some time now, and that is something that we have been covering on the show pretty much nonstop, because conference realignment is going to be crazy this time around. I'll be totally honest with you, and I think it's a very interesting diatribe, because we've all seen throughout these last couple of years where conference realignment can absolutely explode pretty much overnight, right? And that might just be coming for us pretty soon, because ESPN has joined a countersuit by the ACC against Florida State in North Carolina, and this is very interesting because the ESPN group is claiming that Florida State, if they were to release details about their media deal, which some has been released already, so I wonder what's going to happen there, but it would be violating different laws and would be a huge roadblock, obviously, for Florida State to be leaving the ACC. This is obviously a very interesting development. It changes a lot of things kind of in the long term, but I don't think it changes the outcome of Florida State and the ACC. I think that outcome has been set for pretty much the second that Florida State decided that they wanted out. I think they were pretty much out of the conference, if I'm being totally honest. I think Florida State had been, I said it last week a couple of different times, where in college football, the way it works is if there's enough people with enough money that are motivated enough to do something, it's probably going to happen. And in this case, it was Florida State feeling like being in the ACC long term was not the best thing for them. They got together, and it's going to happen. So I don't want to discourage people that are scared of conference realignment and hate this new era, but it's going to happen again. There's going to be a new, flood of teams that are in new conferences or without a conference, or all these different scenarios, which we'll go through in a second. But I tend to believe that before Florida State steps onto the field against Georgia Tech, it will be known that this is their last year in the ACC. So how does that affect the aftermath, right? How does ESPN joining this suit affect the aftermath? Because there's a big thing here that I'm sure a lot of you have already connected the dots here, but ESPN is with the SEC, Fox is with the Big Ten. So the question is here, does this create any division between ESPN and Florida State? Does this create any problems with Florida State wanting to join the SEC? Because then you have to get right back into bed with the ESPN folks that joined a lawsuit against you. So I guess the question for Florida State will be, once all of this is done, because I tend to believe Florida State is out of the ACC. I think they will be rather shortly here because I think all of this stuff has to happen pretty quickly. Will this push them in the direction of the Big Ten? And I tend to believe that the SEC is a quote-unquote better fit for Florida State, but at the end of the day, Florida State can make more money in the Big Ten, and that's the game that we play, right? So I wouldn't be surprised at all if this pushed Florida State even closer to the Big Ten area, because that's where a lot of the money is, and if you don't have to deal with the people that were in a countersuit against you, that might just be a plus. So I wonder what's going to happen with all of this. Does this create animosity between ESPN and Florida State, or is ESPN getting involved to pave the road for Florida State to get out of the conference and then join the SEC? There's tons of different dynamics here that could be at play. The ESPN obviously is the power broker in this situation. They are the ones that control the media rights, that can cut the media rights like nobody's business. They can do a number of different things throughout this process that would totally change the reality that we're living in college football. But the reality is there's going to be a big arms race soon. The last 2 years have been crazy with Texas and OU moving to the SEC, and then the craziness around the Pac-12 a year ago. This might be crazier than either of them, just by the sheer number of teams that will be bouncing around and moving all over the place. There might not be a bigger landslide than the one that is coming fairly soon to the ACC. And I think Florida State will obviously lead others with them. So the question is, if Florida State was to have a little animosity toward ESPN and go towards the Big Ten, would North Carolina, would Clemson, would Virginia, would those teams follow their suit, or would they be more inclined to go to the SEC to not be in the same conference as Florida State? So there's a lot of different competing arguments here, to be totally honest, because a lot of this stuff is totally up in the air. But at the end of the day, this really does come down to Fox against ESPN for a lot of different reasons. We've talked about it a number of different ways, but the people that make decisions in the sport are not the coaches, they're not the players, they're not even really the conference commissioners in a lot of ways. They are the people making these media deals and running these media companies. So Fox and ESPN are about to have a gold rush, whether it comes to Florida State or North Carolina or Clemson, Virginia, Georgia Tech. There's tons of teams that could find their way out of the ACC here pretty soon. And then that just leaves the door open for Fox to come with their best offer and find their way over to the Big Ten, or ESPN to come with their best offer and find their way over to the SEC. So it's going to be an absolute gold rush for either of these media companies, and I think whoever comes out on top will really pave the road for a lot of different things going on in college football going forward, because we've talked about the Big Ten and the SEC are going to run things, but if one creates a little bit of distance between the other, they would run things, because that's the nature of college football, right? But now I don't know if a huge gap can be created using these ACC teams, but at the end of the day, there could be somewhat of a gap, and the Big Ten already makes more money, already holds that card over them. So if they were to add teams like Florida State and maybe North Carolina and maybe Virginia, maybe they would have even more of an argument over the SEC. So a lot of different things at play here. And the one thing to think about in all of this is, what does the ACC do after all of this goes down? Because I think it will go down fairly soon. Does the ACC, first of all, who do they try to hold on to? Because there are some teams that, depending on what the actual dollar figure is for Florida State to leave the conference, depending on what that looks like, there are certain teams that won't be able to match that. That's just the plain truth. There's some schools out there in the ACC that just can't foot the bill that Florida State or Clemson or North Carolina can foot. So I guess the question is, first of all, what is that number? How many teams can the ACC keep around, essentially? And then who do they fill with? Because the Sun Belt is right in that area. There's tons of really good teams, whether it's App State or Troy. JMU is, bursting onto the scene. Conference USA has a ton of good teams, with Liberty obviously kind of leading the way there. There's tons of really, really good teams that they could backload with, but then where does that leave you, right? Because the reality is, when you looked at the Big 12 a year ago, when they were able to backload their conference, whatever that looked like when Texas and Oklahoma left, when they saw all this happening, and Brett Yormark, who in all of this has done an incredible job, partly because he used to be involved in TV deals. He used to be involved in TV, so his understanding for how these people think and how these people work and how these contracts all come about is pretty much second to none in the conference commissioner world. So he is smelling like roses right now, and I guess the ACC doesn't necessarily have the same opportunity to do what the Big 12 did. The Big 12 was massively aided by, in 2022, all of the conference, or I suppose 2023, early part of 2023, all of these schools leaving the Pac-12, they had the ability to jump in and take Colorado, who has become a huge talk of college football, take Arizona, who's going to be one of the top 15 teams in the country this upcoming year, take Utah, who's been one of the most consistent programs in the country for the past pretty much since Kyle Whittingham has gotten there, and take Arizona State, who is an up-and-coming brand in this sport and has a coach that is not afraid to speak his mind and will create some different headlines for you. So basically, the Big 12 had the ability to fill with teams that are roughly on the same level, if not slightly above the people that they had there prior, right? When you talk about Kansas State and Utah, they're roughly on the same level, and they are the teams that are kind of setting the pace out there for the Big 12 this year, and one of those teams is brand new. I don't think the ACC has the ability to do that, because when they backfill, they can't backfill from another Power 5 conference. It's just impossible at this point because there's none left. No one's going to leave the Big 12 right now to join a conference that is losing members. Obviously, no one's leaving the SEC or the Big 10. So you're relegated to the Sun Belt, to Conference USA, to the different conferences around you that are at a lower level. And there are plenty of really, really good teams to pick from, obviously, for the ACC, and that's a great thing for them. But at the end of the day, Troy is not Colorado. App State is not Arizona or Utah. So there is that part of it, right? You don't have the ability to backload the same way that the Big 12 was able to, and that creates a ton of problems because you have 17 teams, 3 of which just came in. All of those teams could be looking for a new home if the ACC is not very careful with how the rest of this suit plays out and then what happens after this suit, because it could be an absolute windfall of teams leaving if Florida State is able to get out for pretty much any number under around $250, $300 million. There are a ton of teams that have the ability to pull that off because they know if they go to the Big Ten or if they go to the SEC, they're getting that money back fairly quickly. Let's be honest. So you're no longer scared to pay that bill. You'd be a little bit more scared to pay $700 billion or $700 million. $700 billion would be out of this world. But paying $700 million is not something that every school in that conference can do. But $200 million, $100 million, they absolutely can. So that creates an interesting couple of months here, and I think the ACC kind of needs ESPN in this battle here. Obviously, there are still a ton of things to figure out with all of this. What is ESPN's motivation by getting into this? What does this mean for the relationship between ESPN and Florida State down the road? But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things changing. There are a lot of moving parts, and conference realignment has created a lot of questions. about the future of the sport. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to get to a place of stability. And I think at the very least, we're on our way there. And it will come at the expense probably of the ACC as we know it. It will come with a lot of teams moving in the next little bit. But at the end of the day, I hope at least we can get to a place, whether it's this year or next year or in 2026 even, where we can look at the landscape of college football and at least know what it looks like. Because I think there are a ton of people out there that just don't know what it's going to look like down the road, so they don't know if they want to sign on for the down the road or not. But the second we know what this looks like, the second we have an idea of just how this is going to affect everything and just who is going to be playing who and what matchups we're getting and how the playoff works and all of this different stuff that has no answer. Once we get to a place where we have at least an idea of what we're dealing with, I think there's much more people that would be willing to and able to fully make a decision of what their future with the sport is. And I tend to believe a lot of people would still stick around because I think it's going to be a better situation than a lot of people expect, but it's going to be a lot different. So strap in, essentially. It's going to be another weird spring with a lot of teams bouncing around to different conferences. But I like to think that this might be the last landslide until we have at least a little time to sit still and catch our breath and come to terms with what this new era of college football is going to look like. But we are going to take a short break here. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about D linemen and linebackers in the combine. They reported yesterday and are going through some tests and stuff today. We'll go through workouts on Thursday, so thought I would break down a couple of guys from each of those positions, the defensive end, defensive tackles, and linebackers, to watch throughout this week and into this weekend. But stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the craziness going on around the ACC and Florida State. ESPN has just jumped into the mix up there, which creates a lot of unanswered questions, but hopefully we are on the way to some answers there. But let's jump into the combine, because tons of stuff going on this week. We had D linemen and linebackers report yesterday, so I thought today would be a great day to break down some of the different guys I thought that would be worth watching throughout this combine process that I think could light the world on fire this week. And we'll start with one guy that pretty much everyone knows, and then one guy that you might not be quite as familiar with at each position. But we'll start with defensive end and Jared Verse. An absolute beast. He had two 9-sack seasons while with the Florida State Seminoles. Is a wildly athletic dude. I think he's going to test totally off the charts, and I think one of the interesting things with him and really all of the defensive ends in this class is it seems like he is fighting with Dallas Turner and Liatu Latu for that top spot, that top defensive end spot, which, as we know in past years, has been able to go in the top 10, while the other two might fall out of the top 10. And while that doesn't seem like a big deal, there is a difference in the amount of money that is going to be made off the bat from those two positions. So I think all three of those guys are going to be very interesting to watch throughout the week. But I think Jared Verse is particularly interesting because, first of all, his physical ability is just off the charts incredible. But also, he went through a very interesting year a year ago, right? All these Florida State players that show up to this combine and have interviews, whether you're Jared Verse or Trey Benson or Jordan Travis, you're going to have a lot of questions about the year that just happened to you. The going 13-0 and getting left out of the playoff. How did you deal with that? How did you come to terms with that, and how did you kind of bounce back, and all of those different things. What happened in the Orange Bowl. Obviously, Jared Verse didn't play in that game, but maybe they'll ask a question about that. So these interviews for particularly the Florida State players, I think, are going to be very, very important because it's going to show a lot of NFL teams just how did they respond to getting left out of the playoff. We know that there were a lot of players that handled themselves actually really remarkably well. Jordan Travis may be chief among them, but you don't really know until you get into a room with someone and get to actually look them in the face and pick their brain about that situation. So I think those interviews are going to be super important. I think this guy is going to test absolutely off the charts, so I don't think that will be remotely a problem for him. But he's currently, according to NFL Network's Daniel Jeremiah, currently sitting right around the 12th overall pick to the Broncos. But again, very much up in the air because I believe he had number 8. I believe he had Dallas Turner going to the Falcons, if I'm not mistaken there. But basically, he had tons of other defensive ends right around that area. So there's a lot of different jockeying for position that's going to go on this week. And I think Jared Verse has all the ability in the world and will have a lot of very interesting interviews to pull from depending on, if he's defensive end 1 or defensive end 3. I think any of those guys could go in any number of those orders. So it'll be very interesting to see what he comes out of this week looking like. But another defensive end that might be a little bit off your radar, although a very, very talented guy, is Darius Robinson from Missouri. He's probably sitting somewhere in the second round, although Daniel Jeremiah does have him 27th overall. So tons of things can happen for him. Obviously, there is a huge difference between going day 1 and having to wait another day or having to wait into the weekend. So he's definitely someone to keep your eye on this week. He had 43 tackles and 8.5 sacks a year ago. Super productive, super disruptive while at Missouri. And obviously got to learn from Kevin Peoples, which is a huge help at the next level because one of the better developers in all of the country. But as I talked about with this defensive end class yesterday, this is one of the deepest classes I've seen in a really long time at that position. There are so many guys that could have an immediate effect on a team, and Darius Robinson is one of them. But at the end of the day, I don't know where he falls in this, craziness that is the defensive end class. But the defensive end class is a lot like the quarterback class in some ways where you have the 3 guys up top fighting. We talked about Jared Verse, Dallas Turner, and Liatu Latu. All of those guys are fighting for the 3 top spots. I think it'd be very, very hard for someone else to jump into that. The same way it'd be really hard for a quarterback to jump into the top 3 that are currently set. But that 4 position is wide open. The same way it is in quarterbacks. That 4 position can still be decided in a number of ways. So maybe that's Darius Robinson, maybe that's someone totally different, but he has every ability to jump into that role. He has every ability to jump into that role, and there are tons of people that can do that, obviously, but I really do like this kid. I think his athletic ability is a little bit above the second tier of defensive ends, if you will, in this class. So I think he's someone definitely to watch throughout this week and throughout the entire draft process to see if he can kind of raise his draft stock a little bit here. But let's get into defensive tackles. Those are the big fun guys in the middle that everyone loves to talk about. But let's start with the guy that is kind of setting the pace for defensive tackles in this draft, in Byron Murphy from Texas. Him and Tavondre Sweat were a remarkable duo last year. Tavondre Sweat was actually the more productive of the two, won the Outland Trophy. But at the end of the day, when you look at Byron Murphy's athletic ability on the inside, it just jumps off the page. It's impossible to overlook what he's capable of doing at, I think, 340 pounds. And I think one of the big things for him is he can actually rush the passer. And it's not necessarily something you always get with defensive tackles. You know, there are a lot of different types of defensive tackles in the world of college football. He is a guy that can absolutely get after the quarterback and do it not, you know, doing bull rushes or pushing the offensive lineman back into the quarterback, but he can throw guys to the side and just keep it moving. He had 5 sacks a year ago, which is pretty insane from the defensive tackle position, and a team in Texas that didn't have a ton of sacks. So he was a big part of their pass rush. Had a couple of pressures in that playoff game against Michael Penix, but Penix was just on another level and sidestepped him and threw a dart. So there are tons to like about this kid. I think his numbers this week will be pretty incredible to see roll in. I think his 40-yard dash will be particularly interesting because I think he can move. I just don't know where he will fall in the defensive tackle ranks, but he could very easily be number one. But I think a lot of what these teams have wanted to see has already been on tape, right? With a lot of these kids, when you're going into the draft, especially when you're at the top of your position, pretty much consensusly like Byron Murphy is, there's not a lot to show necessarily, at least on the field in the combine, but there's a ton of questions to be answered in the interviews and things of that nature because that's where a lot of this is decided, right? You have to know if the kid fits your culture in a lot of different ways. Daniel Jeremiah currently has him 16th overall to the Seahawks, but I've seen him jump into the top 10 a little bit. So tons could happen this week in terms of where he gets drafted. But at the end of the day, I think he's your defensive tackle one. And I think, barring injury, I think there would be very little that would keep him from being in that position and being drafted in the first round, and probably pretty early on in the first round. But another defensive tackle that might be a little bit off the radar here is Tyler Davis. And I like him a lot because he has played so much football. He played 5 years of high-level college football, obviously, at Clemson. Never a bad thing. Obviously, you want them to be able to jump into the league after their third year and be as young as possible and all these different things. But at the end of the day, playing more football is not a bad thing. Being a smarter football player is never a bad thing. And Tyler Davis is absolutely that. Super forceful at the point of attack, has super strong hands, is a great space eater in the run game because he can push the offensive line off their line of scrimmage, essentially. He can win the line of scrimmage and blow up run holes with essentially no break, no question of, no time for the running back to find a hole and cut through it. He would just absolutely blow it up way faster than people would think, and he is way faster than people would think. He can actually kind of fly, and it'll be interesting to see what that 40 time comes in at. But I think he'll fall somewhere in the second round, could be a little bit lower depending on the way he tests. And the big question mark for him is he does have a little bit of an injury history. He missed multiple games in 3 of his 5 years at Clemson. Now, none of those were overly intense injuries. None of those kept him out for long periods of time, but definitely something that teams will be watching for, absolutely, because it's something you have to worry about. So I think the next couple of days will be very embarrassing for him because you get to show who you are and the smarts you have for college football or football in general in those interviews. And then once you get on the field, you get to show that you're fully healthy. And that's really the important thing. But then we'll get to the linebackers here, and we'll start with another Clemson guy, Jeremiah Trotter. Pretty much a copy and paste of Tyler Davis. Super experienced, super smart, a little bit more physically gifted in a lot of ways because the dude can fly. Has sideline to sideline speed, is a great middle linebacker, very, very good tackler, does a great job in the run game. He had 87 tackles a year ago, 89 the year before that, had 5.5 sacks, 2 picks, 2 forced fumbles a year ago. So the dude does a number of different things really, really well. He's probably somewhere in the second round now, but as we know, there's a huge difference between the 33rd pick and the 64th pick in the second round. So he will absolutely be fighting for any position that he can get. This dude is super talented, super smart. I think he will impress tons of teams in his interview because you could throw any football situation at him, and I'm sure he has seen it. So he is definitely someone I'm keeping my eye out on. One of the best linebackers in this class, rated by a lot of people, and I gotta imagine he's just going to be awesome to talk to and pick his brain about football in general. But then we'll get to a linebacker that might be a little bit off your radar. He was on the freaks list by Bruce Feldman over at CBS. Trevin Wallace, linebacker from Kentucky. This dude is an absolute athlete. He's a little bit more of an off-ball linebacker, so playing a little bit outside of the box next to a really good middle linebacker, which is where I think he would really fit. Whether that's Levante David down in Tampa Bay or Fred Warner out in San Francisco, I think there's a number of really good middle linebackers in the NFL that you could put him next to and just let him go be an athlete all over the field, because this dude, sideline to sideline, can do a number of different things. 80 tackles a year ago, 5.5 sacks, 2 turnovers, a pick, and a fumble. Did a number of things really well for Kentucky a year ago, but was next to a very good middle linebacker. So it helps him a lot when you have that stabilizing force next to him. And I think he's someone that is going to light the world on fire in his interviews because he is so high energy. You can tell every time he steps on the field, he just loves football. But also, he does so many things incredibly well. He's incredibly fast, plays really, really well in coverage, which is not a normal thing a lot of the times for linebackers coming into the league. It's usually a little bit of a learning curve there, but he is already at the point where you can put him in coverage against a running back or a slot receiver, and he'll hold up just fine. So he is someone that I think could really, really help his draft stock going through some of the drills that he'll go through, showing his athletic ability and showing overall just his love for the game, because it absolutely jumps off the screen every time that you watch him. But that will bring us to an end to the first of this Combine watch list preview session that I'm going to have throughout the week. We'll follow it up tomorrow with some DBs and tight ends. A little bit different of groups there, but it'll be fun to get into some different players. Obviously, Brock Bowers kind of setting the pace for tight ends over there in the Combine this week, but still tons of guys to talk about, so very excited to go over that tomorrow. But we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the top 10 returning quarterbacks in college football. A lot of contention in this topic, I'm sure. I'm sure I will get a lot of people that do not agree with me, but I'm more than fine with that. We'll have a great time with all of this. So we'll take a short break, and we will be right back. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the D linemen and linebackers to watch throughout this week at the Combine in Indianapolis. And now it's time for one of my favorite segments, Top 10 Tuesdays. Today we will have some returning quarterbacks for 2024. This is a very contentious topic, tons of people giving their take on this, but I have mine, so I figured I would share that with you all. And let's start right at the top with one that I think a lot of people have kind of come around on, apologize for that, is Carson Beck, the quarterback over at Georgia. He had a remarkable last year. He went 72.4 completion percentage, almost 4,000 yards passing, 26 touchdowns, 4 picks. So this dude is mistake-free in a lot of different ways. This dude makes every single play, makes every single smart play, and he's one of the better throwers of the football I've seen since Burrow. I think he's right up there with C.J. Stroud in terms of anticipation, putting the ball exactly where it needs to go, and just kind of going through all of the reads he needs to in a very, very quick manner. And I think one of the big things for him in this upcoming year is him and offensive coordinator Mike Bobo are pretty much in lockstep at this point. They fully understand not only what makes Carson Beck as good as he is, but also what Mike Bobo likes to call and what kind of looks he likes to get into and different stuff like that. So I think that is a huge part of being a successful quarterback, right? Having a play caller that you're in lockstep with, that you understand to no end. And him and Mike Bobo are the epitome of that. And another one that is in lockstep with their play caller is Quinn Ewers. Third year in the Steve Sarkisian offense, had about 3,500 passing yards, 22 touchdowns, and 6 picks a year ago. 5 rushing touchdowns to add along to that. And I think Quinn Ewers is obviously a very talented thrower of the football. He's had different injury troubles throughout his first 2 years at Texas that have made some fans a little bit nervous going into this year. But at the end of the day, he has only gotten more comfortable slowly throughout his time at Texas. And I think year 3, he'll have even more ability to go through his reads quickly, to know exactly what's coming, and get the ball out of his hands. Because at the end of the day, when you look at that Texas offense, they have tons of toys to play with, tons of guys that can make incredible plays, and Steve Sarkisian likes it that way. And I think Quinn Ewers will really like it that way, because whenever you can throw a screen out into the flat and it goes 75 yards for a touchdown, it's never a bad thing for the quarterback. And I think that could happen a couple of different times this year with the group that Sark has brought in from the transfer portal, whether it's wide receivers or the tight end in Amari Niblack. Tons of guys that he can play around with and have different stuff going towards. So very interested to see what Quinn Ewers can do in his third year. And then we get to Dillon Gabriel, maybe one of the biggest transfers in this entire game. Dillon Gabriel going from Oklahoma to Oregon, taking over for Bo Nix, and that's got to be a blessing for Will Stein, because there was a little bit of a worry of what the quarterback position was going to look like. Now they have one of the best quarterback rooms in the country, with Dante Moore backing up Dillon Gabriel. Both guys were starters at different times for Power 5 teams last year, so never a bad thing to have 2 of those guys in your room. I think Will Stein has got to be smiling ear to ear every time he shows up to work. But Dillon Gabriel is one of the smarter, more experienced quarterbacks on this list, obviously. Played, I think, 3 years at UCF before coming over to Oklahoma to join his old offensive coordinator in Jeff Lebby. And I think he is someone that at least brings stability to a place where they absolutely need it. Oregon is right in the crosshairs of a lot of teams in the Big Ten, and right in the mix for a national championship, possibly. I had them, I think, 4th in my top 10 a week ago, and Dillon Gabriel has a ton to do with that, because a lot like Texas and Quinn Ewers, he's just got to get the ball to these guys, and they'll make tons of plays. I mean, Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, both those guys are going to be huge, have huge effects on what they can do this year, and I think having someone like Dillon Gabriel that gets the ball out of his hands fast and puts it on target is a huge help to that, obviously. And now we'll get into Shedeur Sanders, someone that everyone has an opinion on. Much like his father, they either love him or they hate him, and I tend to love him. I got to be honest. I think he is someone that is as athletic of any quarterback on this list, I think. Can do a number of different things, extending plays. I mean, we saw it. He absolutely had to extend plays sometimes last year because of the offensive line play. And I think that's the question mark here, right? I have very few questions about Shedeur Sanders' ability. I have very few questions about the cast of characters he has around him, because it's going to be talented at the wide receiver and running back position. I have very few questions about his ability to execute the offense. Now, he did lose his offensive coordinator in Sean Lewis, so definitely something to keep an eye on there, but I don't have really many doubts surrounding Shedeur Sanders, if I'm being totally honest. I do have doubts surrounding his offensive line. They did bring in a ton of transfers and younger guys like Jordan Seaton to start essentially right away, but that's got to come together, and it's got to come together relatively quickly, because playing in the Big 12 with so many teams that are right around each other in terms of what they're capable of doing, it could be a problem if you can't protect him and at least give him time to go through his reads, because it could be a long day. And Shedeur Sanders is capable of making some mistakes if you force them into him. So he's definitely someone that I think it all falls on the shoulder of those 5 guys up front, depending on what Shedeur Sanders is capable of doing in 2024. But we'll move right on here. We got Jackson Dart at the number 5 position. I was kind of debating between him and Milroe 5 and 6, but I like Jackson Dart at 5. I think, like Quinn Ewers' third year in the offense, getting even more comfortable in that Lane Kiffin offense, and they're not easy offenses to run. Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian do not necessarily make it easy on their quarterbacks. They put a lot on their shoulders to understand the game, to understand different reads and things of that nature. So Jackson Dart has slowly been getting better throughout his time there. And I think year 3 might be the time he absolutely explodes. Obviously, Trey Harris on the outside, Caden Priestcorn at tight end. Both those guys are going to have huge years, and Jackson Dart should be at the center of all of this, and should be right up there with some of the best quarterbacks in the SEC. I have him third here, so definitely tons of really good talent in the SEC at quarterback, but I think Jackson Dart is right up there with him. And then Jalen Milroe, a guy that definitely could have been higher on this list, but I figure 6 is right around the right spot. I am a little bit interested to see what happens with him and Nick Sheridan, because a lot of Jalen Milroe's success falls on Nick Sheridan's shoulders, right? A year ago, there was some worry early in the year about his ability, and I don't know if it was so much his ability as the play calling that was happening around him, and I think it took a while for Tommy Rees to get up to speed and to figure out what's the best way to put Jalen Milroe into winning situations. And he officially figured that out, and then he burst onto the scene and makes tons of plays down the stretch of last season. But I don't think he's hit his ceiling yet. I think he's still capable of playing even better football, but Nick Sheridan's going to be a huge part of making that work. And the offensive line that has a lot of new faces, and Parker Brailsworth, and I believe one more kid from Washington that I'm blanking on the name right now, but all of this stuff is going to come into play. There's tons of stuff moving around Alabama. Jalen Milroe is a sticking point that they're comfortable with, and they got to hope that he is able to continue to grow because the SEC is not getting any easier, especially from the quarterback position. So it's going to be an interesting year for him and the new era there in Alabama, but he holds all the cards essentially in this new era of Alabama football. But we'll get into some interesting picks now, I think. Cam Ward I have at 7, and I know there are a lot of people that would call me crazy for that. I think he has as much ability as most of the guys on this list. I think he just happened to play in Pullman, Washington, and there's no disrespect to the Cougars. Absolutely rooting for you guys throughout the year, but at the end of the day, it is a different ball game, right? So I think when he gets to Miami, when he has the offensive line in front of him that he's going to have, when he has the running game that he's going to have, I think he's going to excel. I think he's one of the most important players in the entire ACC this year because Miami is one of the most important teams, a huge mystery team in that conference. So I think he could have as big of effect on ACC and college football as anyone in the country this year. But we'll keep it rolling here. We got Brady Cook in the 8th spot. Super experienced and smart, kind of what I was talking about with Dylan Gabriel. Fully understands the offense, has Luther Burden right next to him, which helps a ton. But this guy just makes tons of right plays, which is obviously the ultimate goal in this game. So he is someone I just feel good about every single week going out there and putting up a really good performance. Another guy I feel really good about doing that is Grayson McCall. Tons of football under this guy's belt, like Dylan Gabriel, like Brady Cook. Tons of football behind him at Coastal Carolina. Is now at NC State and part of the Wolfpack. So he is someone that has tons of ability, has tons of talent, is now taking it to the next level, and you better hope that his best football is still in front of him because he's going to have to play even better at this next level than he did while at Coastal Carolina, and he played really, really good football while at Coastal Carolina. So he's definitely someone I'm watching throughout the year. I think he could put NC State right in the mix for the ACC. And then Noah Fafita, the guy that decided he was going to stay put in a world where not a lot of guys stay put. He decided he was going to stick it out with Arizona and with Brett Brennan as the new head coach there. And I'm very excited to see him this year. Newly hired offensive coordinator Dino Babers will have to, get that rolling as quickly as possible, but I have full faith in him to do that. And then Tatori McMillan right next to him. that is one of the best duos in the entire country when it comes down to quarterbacks and wide receivers. So very excited to see what he can do this year. I think he's going to be awesome. But yeah, that rounds out my top 10. Definitely some interesting picks in here. Let me know what you think about those. But that will do it for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a ton to us, so please remember to subscribe to the channel, leave a positive review. It does make a difference for us here at the channel. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter or X, TikTok, Instagram for all of the updates throughout every single sport. We have tons of great people around the network doing tons of great work across the NBA, all sports, NFL, everywhere that you can think of. So if you need any updates on the sporting world, come right over to our page and we'll have someone that will update you, no problem. But thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.
Mm-hmm.